I didn't like it, but it didn't stop me playing. And, I just played the way I played. I play emotionally. Ringo Starr, the least talented drummer of the Beatles, is often remembered for his humor and carefree attitude on stage. Yet behind that cheerful facade lay scars and bitterness that, if revealed, would shock the public. During his years with the Beatles, Ringo endured more than his share of being looked down upon by A-list stars. Some who were once close friends eventually ignored him. Others, though immensely talented, spiraled into destructive habits, smashing things, indulging in drugs, staging shocking antics. But what may surprise most is that another legend admired worldwide became the person Ringo truly despised for losing himself completely to the obsession with a woman. So who exactly are the people on this list? And after all these years, was Ringo Starr really as talentless and useless as the press so often claimed? Ringo Starr, Richard Starkey, came into the world in Liverpool during the dark days of World War II. At just 6 years old, Richard collapsed with peritonitis and was forced to leave school for over a year. By the age of 13, he was stricken with tuberculosis and confined to a sanatorium for 2 long years. Richard grew up with only a basic education, quiet and withdrawn by nature. But then a spark appeared. Nurses handed him a small drum to pass the time. The monotonous tapping soon turned into a rhythm, opening the door to a new world where music became his dream. In the early 1960s, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and drummer Pete Best were still struggling on the stages of Hamburg and Liverpool. Their music was exploding with energy, but their drumming lacked life. George tried to push the band forward, but deep down they all knew something was missing. Not far away, a different beat was resonating from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Behind the kit sat Richard Starkey. He didn't show off. He simply kept time with unwavering steadiness. But that very consistency lifted the songs to another level. The Beatles quickly realized they was the drummer they needed. In 1962, when the Beatles signed with EMI, their producer bluntly expressed dissatisfaction with Pete Best. On August 16th, Pete was fired, and Ringo became the missing piece of the puzzle. Yet within that moment of triumph was a paradox. Though adored by fans, Ringo was often dismissed by critics as the least talented Beatle. Musicians and newspapers mocked that he only knew how to keep time. One headline even sneered, "Ringo is the luckiest drummer in the world because his friends are Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison." Even more painful, Ringo himself was keenly aware of his place. While John and Paul were crafting immortal songs, and George was slowly emerging as a gifted songwriter, Ringo was usually relegated to the background. Occasionally, he was given a song or two to sing, but they were mostly playful numbers chosen to amuse, as if he were merely there to make the audience laugh. And yet Ringo possessed something. None of the others did a direct, heartfelt connection with the audience. On stage, he always smiled, cracked little jokes. Fans screamed his name with the same passion they had for the other 3 stars. Then at 85, with his hair turned silver, Ringo Starr finally opened up. He revealed a list of names he could never forgive. These were not spur-of-the-moment grudges, but wounds etched over decades. They included musical legends, once beloved friends, even icons worshipped across the world. But to Ringo, they were bound to feelings of contempt, abandonment, and scars that would never heal. George Harrison, the best friend who became the abandoner. Though George Harrison and Ringo Starr were once close friends, as George began to assert his position as a musician, the distance between them became increasingly apparent. George dove into major collaborations with Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Billy Preston, and a host of other illustrious artists in the concert for Bangladesh. Meanwhile, Ringo, who had stood by George since the early Beatles days, was slowly forgotten, as if his presence was becoming merely symbolic. The moment that pained Ringo the most was witnessing Eric Clapton record the guitar for "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." It wasn't just an artistic decision by George. It was a cruel reminder. Even within the group, Ringo wasn't the only one who could be replaced. He bitterly whispered, "Turns out I'm not the only one in the band who's being left behind." George was a perfectionist, always seeking new voices and outside collaborators. But to Ringo, that wasn't creativity. It was indifference. Every time George called on another artist instead of him, Ringo felt himself fading, being pushed out of the innermost circle. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, the distance grew even wider. George was busy with his solo projects with recording sessions alongside new friends, while Ringo struggled to find his footing in a music world that was too accustomed to seeing him as the least talented Beatle. In a rare reunion, Ringo half-jokingly said, "You've got the whole world to collaborate with George except me." George just offered a tight-lipped smile and said nothing. But that very silence was like a knife twisting in Ringo's heart. He knew George didn't mean any harm, but the silence was confirmation of a bitter truth. He was no longer a crucial choice. For Ringo, this was a deeper pain than the fiery conflicts with Lennon or McCartney. It's easier to accept being disdained by an enemy, but being abandoned by your best friend, that's a terrible and unhealing wound. And if George Harrison caused Ringo pain with his silence and indifference, another person in the group inflicted a completely different kind of bitterness. Not abandonment, but a frightening transformation when friendship was replaced by infatuation. John Lennon, the man who went mad for a woman. Ringo Starr always respected John Lennon. He was intelligent, sharp, and commanded a presence that made the entire room fall silent when he spoke. For Ringo, grinning behind Lennon was a source of pride, as if he were keeping the beat for a true leader. But then, from 1968 to 1969, as Yoko Ono became a constant presence next to John, everything began to crack. Ringo often felt that Lennon was sidelining him. John was no longer the sober and dignified leader. He was a man so captivated by a woman that he lost all reason. On one occasion during a recording session for an experimental track, Yoko suddenly interrupted to give her opinion on the drumming. In the past, Lennon might have laughed and defended his friend, but this time he immediately turned to Ringo and said coldly, "Ringo, you don't need to overthink it. Just hit it evenly. That's enough." The entire room fell silent. Ringo felt his face flush with anger. He understood that he wasn't just being belittled for his skill, but was also being denied his status as an artist. All because John didn't want to upset Yoko. The thorn grew bigger as Lennon increasingly ignored the band to immerse himself in projects with Yoko Ono. Ringo bitterly told a friend that they used to be a band, but with John, it was now just him and Yoko. Worse, anyone who showed annoyance toward Yoko would send John into a rage. Once, when George Harrison was frustrated with Yoko's interference, Lennon immediately yelled and slammed his hand on the table like a man out of control. In Ringo's eyes, this was no longer John Lennon, the genius who once led the Beatles, but a man so blinded he was willing to burn down a musical dynasty to protect his lover. Ringo finally couldn't hold back. He threw his drumsticks to the floor, pointed at Lennon, and growled, "You look down on me without me. Bear, would you get the beat to sing these nonsensical songs?" John just gave a cold laugh, then turned to Yoko, holding her hand in a defiant gesture. That look of contempt only deepened the rift. For Ringo. From that moment, John was no longer a talented leader, but had become a traitor, leaving the entire band behind in a mad obsession with a woman who was possibly using him. But it didn't stop there. Another name outside the group created a completely different kind of contempt for him. Not because of a broken friendship, but because of a chaotic and fake lifestyle. Jim Morrison, The Doors, the chaotic man of addiction and shock value. Jim Morrison, the frontman of The Doors, often appeared drunk, screaming, and rolling around on stage. In Ringo Starr's eyes, this wasn't art. It was a circus act disguised as rebellion. In a conversation, Ringo frankly stated, "Morrison doesn't perform music. He performs his own downfall." Ringo had to fight his way through hospital stays since childhood, and then worked hard to earn his place in the Beatles. He believed music should be the result of hard work and discipline. Therefore, he particularly despised those who turned the stage into a place for indulgence in alcohol, drugs, and shocking stunts. Jim Morrison was the complete opposite of everything Ringo valued. At his shows, Morrison would get drunk, forget lyrics, and even be dragged off stage by the police. Yet the American press still hailed him as a poet of darkness, a rebel star. To Ringo, that was ridiculous. If self-destruction is called art, then all the city pubs in Liverpool are full of geniuses. And what Ringo hated about Morrison wasn't just his self-destruction, but how the public deified it. He saw Morrison as proof that the era was too lenient a drug addict with more scandals than talent was elevated to a legend. In Ringo's memory, Jim Morrison would forever be a fake star, a person whom the stage lights didn't illuminate, but instead exposed his raw chaos. To him, Morrison wasn't an artist, but a mass intoxication that society mistook for music. If Jim Morrison's fake chaos made Ringo feel contempt, then more bitterly, another person made him